There's a specific kind of silence that happens when you log into your bank account and something doesn't look right. It's not panic, not immediately. It's confusion, because numbers don't just vanish, not from accounts that took 42 years to build. I remember exactly where I was. Kitchen counter, Tuesday morning, coffee gone cold beside my laptop, my reading glasses sliding down the bridge of my nose. I'd logged in to transfer money for property taxes on the lake house. Simple, routine, except the balance was wrong. Not a little wrong, catastrophically wrong. I refreshed the page once, twice, 3 times, still wrong. The retirement account, the one I'd built through decades of real estate closings, late nights, market crashes, and stubborn survival, showed a balance reduced by over $750,000. $750,000. Gone. My first thought wasn't fraud. It was glitch. Because fraud happens to careless people, not to someone who spent 30 years reviewing closing disclosures down to the penny. Not to someone like me. I called the bank immediately. After the usual robotic maze, press 1, press 2, please listen carefully, a young man named Eric picked up. He sounded 25, maybe younger. "Ma'am," he said politely, "I'm seeing authorized distributions." Authorized. That word hit differently. "Authorized by who?" I asked. Pause, keyboard clicking. "According to our records, authorized under your financial advisory structure." Financial advisory structure. That meant only one thing. David, my son-in-law. David had married my daughter Claire 7 years ago. He wore expensive watches but never mentioned brands, drove quiet cars, smiled with his lips, not his eyes. He was calm in that rehearsed way men are when they're always calculating 3 moves ahead. Financial advisor, fiduciary, certified, licensed, trusted. He handled high net worth clients, retirees, executives, widows, people like me. Actually, not like me. I'd never hired him. Claire insisted. "Mom, you can trust him," she'd said. "He literally does this for a living." Trust him. Funny phrase now. The bank emailed the authorization documents while Eric stayed on the line. Digital signatures, clean, official, dated across the past 11 months. Structured withdrawals, $48,000, $62,500, $91,000. Never round enough to look reckless, never frequent enough to trigger internal alerts. Strategic, professional, predatory. My signature sat at the bottom of each form, except it wasn't mine, not really. It was perfect, too perfect, cleaner than anything I'd ever signed with arthritic fingers and fading patience. I hung up and sat there for a long time. You don't cry immediately when something like that happens. Your brain protects you. It insists there must be a reasonable explanation. Claire had access to my house. David had access to my accounts, temporarily, during tax restructuring last year. Temporary access, permanent consequences. I called Claire. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey, Mom," she said warmly. "Everything okay?" Her voice was normal, casual, unaffected. "I was reviewing my accounts," I said carefully. Silence. Tiny. Barely there. Then, "Okay." I noticed several withdrawals. Another pause. Longer this time. That's David's department, she said quickly. He's optimizing your portfolio. Optimizing. Corporate euphemism for moving money without emotional attachment. I didn't authorize $750,000 in withdrawals. Silence again. But this time it wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Mom, she said slowly, David would never do anything without your consent. Never. Absolute language. Dangerous language. Can you come over tonight? I asked. Why? Because I want to look you in the eyes while you decide whether to lie. But I didn't say that. I just feel better talking in person, she hesitated. I'll check with David. Check with David. Not I'll come. Not I'm on my way. Check with David. That told me everything. Their house smelled like eucalyptus and expensive denial. David greeted me at the door. Perfect posture, perfect tone, perfect composure. Margaret, he said warmly, good to see you. I studied his face. No anxiety, no fear, which meant one of two things. Either he was innocent or he believed he was untouchable. We sat at their kitchen island. Claire wouldn't meet my eyes. David leaned forward, fingers interlocked. I assume this is about the distributions, he said calmly. Distributions. Not withdrawals. Not missing funds. Distributions. Language is armor. Yes, I said. He nodded. All transactions were executed under authorized advisory discretion. Authorized. That word again. I never gave discretionary authority, I replied. His smile didn't falter. You signed the authorization last February. He slid a document across the counter. My signature stared back at me. Perfect. Controlled. Forged. I didn't sign this, I said quietly. Claire inhaled sharply. David didn't move, didn't blink, didn't flinch. Instead, he said something that made my blood run cold. You may not remember signing it. Not remember. Subtle, insidious, planting doubt, not accusing, suggesting, gaslighting with paperwork. I leaned back slowly, studied him, studied her, and that's when I realized something worse than theft. They weren't afraid. They expected confusion. They expected weakness. They expected time. What they didn't expect was that I still kept physical copies of everything, and buried inside a locked filing cabinet in my study was something they had never seen, something that could unravel all of it, and they had no idea it existed. I didn't argue with them that night. That's what David expected: emotion, confusion, age. He expected me to spiral, to question my memory, to doubt my instincts, to hand him the narrative he'd already prepared. Instead, I nodded slowly, folded the document, and slid it back toward him. I'll review my records, I said calmly. His eyes narrowed just slightly. Not enough for Claire to notice, but enough for me, because that wasn't the response he'd rehearsed for. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the sound of tires against asphalt and 42 years of financial discipline replaying in my head. You don't survive 2 recessions, a divorce, and the 2008 housing crash by being careless. You survive by documenting everything. And I had. The filing cabinet sat in the back corner of my study, steel, heavy, unassuming. Inside were decades of contracts, property deeds, escrow statements, tax returns, handwritten notes. and one folder David had never seen because I'd never told him it existed. Contingency. My late attorney, Samuel Green, insisted I keep it. Trust isn't a financial strategy, he used to say. Verification is. I opened the folder. Inside were original authorization agreements, every advisory relationship, every signature, every clause, including the temporary advisory agreement David convinced me to sign last year. Temporary, limited, restricted. And most importantly, it did not grant discretionary withdrawal authority, not even close. I sat down and compared his document to mine. At first glance, they looked identical. Same formatting, same firm letterhead, same legal language. But David had underestimated something. People rarely read contracts twice. I do. Line 14 in my original agreement stated clearly, advisor may not execute withdrawals or distributions without direct written consent for each transaction. In his version, line 14 read differently. Advisor may execute discretionary distributions in accordance with portfolio strategy. One sentence, one illegal sentence, inserted seamlessly, professionally, deliberately. My hands stayed steady, but inside something shifted. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was engineering. I slept maybe 2 hours that night. At 6:03 a.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I don't answer unknown numbers, but nothing about this situation was normal anymore. Margaret Collins? A woman asked. Yes. My name is Andrea. I work in compliance at Halverson Financial. David's firm. Compliance doesn't call unless something is already wrong. We've detected several unusual asset movements connected to your advisory profile, she said carefully. Unusual. Corporate code for liability. I'm aware, I replied. Pause. Then she asked something interesting. Have you personally authorized Mr. David Halverson to execute discretionary withdrawals exceeding $500,000? I let the silence stretch. No, I said. Her breathing changed slightly, faster, less rehearsed. Thank you, she said quietly. That's important. Important, meaning this wasn't internal anymore. It was investigatory. 2 hours later, Claire called. Her voice sounded different, tighter. Mom, she said, did you contact David's firm? No. Silence. They're auditing his accounts, she said. Ah, so it had begun. That sounds appropriate, I replied calmly. You're overreacting, she snapped suddenly. Overreacting. Classic pivot. Blame the victim. Not the theft, not the forgery, the reaction. You took $750,000 from me, I said evenly. Another silence. Then quietly, we needed it. Needed. Not borrowed, not invested. Needed. That word landed heavier than any number. For what? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said something that fractured everything I thought I understood. David's firm isn't doing well. Not doing well. Financial advisors don't lose money quietly. They lose clients. They lose credibility. They lose everything. How much trouble is he in? I asked. Her voice dropped. A lot. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. My daughter hadn't sounded malicious. She sounded scared, which made this worse. because fear makes people justify anything, even betraying their own mother. At 11:42 a.m., I received an email. Subject line, Formal Investigation Notice. Halverson Financial was initiating an internal review of David's client portfolios. Plural, not just mine. That's when the second realization hit. This wasn't isolated. This was pattern. But here's the twist David never saw coming. The $750,000 he moved wasn't actually sitting in his firm's accounts anymore. I knew because I'd followed the transfer trail in the statements. Layered transactions, account to account, entity to entity, until finally it landed somewhere unexpected. An LLC, registered not to David, not to Claire, but to a name I didn't recognize. And buried deep in the registration records was an address that changed everything. Because it wasn't a business office, it was a private residence. And it belonged to someone who had no legal connection to my family. Someone David had never mentioned. Someone who had been quietly receiving my money for months, which meant one thing. This wasn't just theft. It was partnership. And David wasn't acting alone. I parked across the street and sat there with the engine off. The house looked normal. White siding, blue shutters, wind chimes hanging from the porch. There was a silver Lexus in the driveway. Recent model, clean. Not the kind of car someone struggling financially would drive. Which meant whoever lived here wasn't desperate. They were comfortable with my money. I stayed there for 20 minutes, watching. No movement, no sign of David's car, no sign of Claire, just stillness. Finally, I stepped out. My knees didn't shake. That surprised me. 42 years of closing deals had taught me one thing. Fear doesn't change facts. Action does. I walked up the driveway and rang the bell. Footsteps approached almost immediately. Not hesitant, not cautious, confident. The door opened, and for a second my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. She couldn't have been older than 35. Dark hair, composed posture, calm eyes. She looked at me like she already knew who I was. "Margaret," she said softly. Not a question, a statement. That's when the air left my lungs. "You know me," I said. She nodded. Yes. No denial, no confusion, no performance, just acceptance. "Who are you?" I asked. She hesitated, then stepped aside. "You should come in." The house smelled like citrus and expensive quiet, minimalist furniture, clean lines, intentional design, not temporary, permanent. She motioned for me to sit. "I'm Elena," she said. Her voice was steady, too steady. "And you've been receiving my money," I replied. She didn't argue, didn't pretend, didn't lie. Yes. The word hung there between us, simple, unapologetic, dangerous. "How do you know my son-in-law?" I asked. Her eyes flickered slightly. Not guilt, not exactly. Complication. "We've worked together," she said. Worked together. Corporate phrasing again. Everyone hides behind language. For how long? A little over a year. A year, right when the withdrawals started. "And my daughter?" I asked carefully. Elena looked directly at me. She knows. That sentence hurt more than the missing money ever could. Not suspicion, not manipulation, knowledge. Claire knew. My chest tightened, not from anger, from clarity. Because betrayal is worse when it's coordinated. She said you needed it, I whispered. Elena didn't react, which meant she already knew Claire had told me that, which meant they'd talked recently about me. David was under pressure, Elena said finally. Pressure, everyone's favorite excuse. He made bad investments, lost client money. He needed liquidity to stabilize positions. Positions, not lives, not trust. Positions. And mine was convenient, I said. She didn't argue, because arguing would imply innocence. This wasn't innocence. This was execution. I stood slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, the wind moved the trees gently, ordinary life continuing, while mine had quietly fractured. How much did he tell you about me? I asked. She hesitated, then said something I didn't expect. He said you wouldn't notice. The words landed harder than any accusation. Not notice, not fight, not matter. Just not notice. I turned back toward her. And what exactly are you to him? I asked. Partner, investor, accomplice, mistress. The possibilities crowded my mind. Her silence answered before her words did. It's complicated. Complicated is what people say when the truth is ugly. Then she said something that shifted everything. I told him not to do it. I stared at her. You expect me to believe that? He said he'd replace it before you ever knew, she continued, that it was temporary. Temporary, always temporary, until it isn't. My phone buzzed in my purse. Claire. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched Elena, studied her face, looking for remorse, for guilt, for anything human. What do you gain from this? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Survival. That word again. Survival makes people dangerous because survival justifies everything. As I turned to leave, she spoke again. There's something else you should know. I stopped, didn't turn around. David isn't the one who moved the first transfer, she said quietly. My stomach dropped, slow, heavy. What do you mean? Her voice softened. It wasn't his idea. I turned, and for the first time, she looked uncomfortable. He said Claire convinced him. The room went silent, not dramatic, not explosive, just still. Because betrayal hits differently when it changes shape. David wasn't protecting Claire, he was following her. I drove home on autopilot. Claire's calls kept coming. 7 missed calls, 2 voicemails, 1 text. Mom, please don't do anything yet. Yet. Which meant she knew exactly what I was capable of. When I got home, there was an envelope on my front door. No stamp, hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed, cold, professional. A transfer confirmation. Another $95,000 pending authorization, scheduled for tomorrow morning. They weren't stopping, even now, even after confrontation, even after exposure. Which meant one thing. They believed I still wouldn't act. They believed I was still just their mother, not their risk, not their consequence, not their end. They were wrong, because buried inside that same filing cabinet was something neither of them knew existed, something that didn't just protect my money, It protected my control. And once I used it, everything they'd built with my stolen money would collapse overnight. I didn't call Claire back. Not that night, not the next morning. Because once you understand the full shape of betrayal, you don't react emotionally. You respond strategically. At 8:02 a.m., I sat at my desk with the contingency folder open in front of me. Samuel Green, my late attorney, used to call it my insurance against human nature. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now I realized he'd been realistic. Inside the folder was a document I hadn't needed in over a decade, a legal instrument tied to the original structure of my retirement trust. One clause, buried deep, ignored by anyone who didn't read every page, which meant David had never noticed it, which meant Claire hadn't either. It was called a revocation trigger, simple language, brutal effect. If financial misconduct or unauthorized fiduciary activity was detected by an advisor connected through family affiliation, all managed assets could be immediately frozen, reversed, and transferred into a protected custodial structure under sole owner authority. Mine. No advisory discretion, no intermediary access, no delay, just control, total control. At 8:17 a.m., I called the estate attorney. "I'm invoking the revocation clause," I said. Silence. Then he exhaled slowly. "That's decisive." "Yes." "Are you certain?" I thought about Route 47, about the empty look in Claire's eyes, about David calmly suggesting I might not remember signing away my life savings. "Yes," I said. "I'm certain." By 9:42 a.m., the freeze was complete. Every account David had touched locked instantly. Pending transfers canceled. LLC inflows halted. Access permissions revoked. And most importantly, every dollar still traceable within the financial network flagged for recovery, including the $95,000 they had tried to move that morning. At 10:11 a.m., my phone rang. David. I let it ring twice before answering. "What did you do?" he asked, voice tight. Not angry, terrified. "I protected myself," I replied calmly. "You've frozen everything." "Yes." "You can't do that." "I already did." Silence, heavy, breathing on the other end. "You don't understand the consequences," he said. "Oh, I understood perfectly. You should have considered the consequences before forging my signature." His voice cracked slightly. "You're destroying my career." No, he'd done that himself. I was simply turning on the lights. Claire showed up an hour later. No warning, no phone call, just pounding on my front door like urgency could undo reality. When I opened it, she looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. "You froze the accounts," she said. Not accusation, confirmation. Yes. Her eyes filled with something fragile, not anger, fear. "David says they're auditing everything." "They should." Her voice dropped. He could lose his license. License, career, status. Everything he'd gambled my money to preserve. Then she said it. The truth she'd been carrying. "We were drowning," she whispered. Mortgage, loans, failed investments, a lifestyle they couldn't sustain. "He said it was temporary," she added. Temporary. The most dangerous word in finance. because temporary violations become permanent crimes when discovered. "You could have told me," I said quietly. She shook her head. "You would have said no." Yes, I would have. Because protecting your children doesn't mean enabling their destruction. 3 weeks later, the investigation concluded. Halverson Financial terminated David immediately. License suspended pending federal review. Civil recovery proceedings initiated. Northbridge Strategic Holdings dissolved under audit pressure. And slowly, carefully, methodically, my money began returning. Not all at once, but enough to prove something important. They had never truly owned it. They had only borrowed time. Claire didn't call during those weeks, not once. Not until the letter arrived, handwritten, not typed, not polished, just ink, messy, human. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote. "I just want you to know I never stopped loving you. Love doesn't erase consequence, but consequence doesn't erase love either. That's the cruel math of family." Months later, I drove past that same suburban street where Elena had lived. The house was empty, for sale sign out front. Life moves quickly after exposure. People relocate, reinvent, rewrite their stories. But financial records don't forget, and neither do I. Here's the final truth. They didn't steal $750,000 from me. Not really. They stole something else. Certainty. The certainty that family and trust occupy the same space. Now I know better. Trust isn't permanent. It's conditional, verified, protected, enforced. Last week I logged into my account again. The balance sat there quietly, restored, stable, safe. Just numbers on a screen, but numbers backed by something stronger now, awareness. Because the most dangerous thing you can underestimate is a woman who built everything herself. They thought age meant weakness. They thought family meant immunity. They thought I wouldn't act. They were wrong. And they'll live with that longer than I ever will.